to today's OTT. I'm going to talk about AWS Cedar. So the next time that you want to do authorization for your projects, you may want to consider AWS Cedar. I'm going to show you why. And even if you think Cedar is not right for you, I think I'm going to share some things that are super useful when it comes to organizing your code and making sure you're not getting just so many bugs out of your code from having authorization spread everywhere, which I think something just so important to avoid. So what is AWS Cedar? It's an open source project developed by AWS, and you see that it is split in open source and proprietary technology, but at the core you're seeing here at the center a policy that is doing something, and it has a structure in which it starts with a certain decision. In this case it's permit, but it could also be forbid. So the first thing that a policy is doing is saying if something can or cannot happen, and there are three important elements here: the principle, the action, and the resource. The principle is who is making the call, the action is what they're trying to do, and the resource is what they're doing the action against. In this example, the principle is a user, and the only thing that we know about the principle is that it belongs to the group Jane Friends. And well, I took this example from the official Cedar documentation. You're gonna find many interesting things there, and we're gonna take a look together later in this video. But what I want to show you here is just the basic formula for a Cedar policy. So the other thing we have is the action, which is view photo. So someone is trying to view a photo and they are in the group Jane Friends. The last thing that we know is this resource is in an album called Jane Trips. And well, there is a lot of info. We're probably dealing with an application that is a kind of a picture sharing thing, or a picture application, because there's an album, there's a view photo, and there's groups of users. And if you want the official definition, you can read the slide and you can go to the official docs, but I just want to give you a quick overview. And let me put me here. And an important concept that I wanted to bring over is the idea that when you create your application, you should be separating business logic from access decisions, meaning anything that deals with authorization should happen separately from your regular business logic. That leads to cleaner code. And if you're using something like AWS Cedar, you also get the power of customizing policies, and you can treat those policies like data, and you can expose that data to some user that is like a super admin or something, and if they can edit those policies either directly or via an interface, they can make really powerful changes and decide what the users in the application can and cannot do. And you may be thinking, I'm happy with what I have. I'm doing role-based access control. Why would I change it? And the biggest reason is called role explosion. I do advise you to Google it and learn what that is. But applications that start with RBAC have the tendency to fall into this issue, which is basically the situation in which you start to change your code. You start to create many roles to represent different things, and you just end up with a system that is unflexible, and it's unclear what users can and cannot do. And you may have like an admin and an admin powerful, you may have an admin editor, and you just start creating these roles that have just small changes. And you would say the front end, you make a tiny change to accommodate that new role. You go into the back and you do the same thing. So now everywhere in your code base, you're doing these small little checks. and your users will be pretty unhappy with all the confusion, all of the bugs, and everything that's going to happen. And your developers are going to be maybe more unhappy because now they have to deal with that code base that has roles spread everywhere. So that's where I stop with my advisory, and I do think you should think about it at least when you're building your system. Make sure you're separating business logic from access decisions, and you're not doing that everywhere. And before we transition to really talking about Cedar and showing you more examples, this is, I promise you, the last slide that I give you concepts, like these high-level concepts. And in this case, I just want to go deeper into what options do you have. So you may already agree with me that you should separate your code where authorization happens separate from your business logic. And now you're deciding to what exactly is your authorization based on. And it is totally fine to start off with RBAC. It is the simplest one and the fastest one to implement. Totally fine. You start with RBAC, which is a role can do an action. So only two elements are enough to decide if an action is allowed or not. So the code base should be simple enough. The system should be very, very straightforward, and that's fine. But when you realize that you need to do more, avoid creating more roles and falling into role explosion. Make sure that layer that you created separate from your business logic can now be transformed in something. That something could be ABAC, and it could also be ReBAC. What is ABAC? ABAC is attribute-based access control. It is, if we kind of read what it means, a principal can do an action to a resource in the context of some attributes. So that's a lot of stuff. Now we have 4 elements necessary to decide if something is allowed or denied. The principal we already saw, right, in the Cedar example, it's someone, and there's some context about that person. They maybe belong to a group, they exist in a certain hierarchy. The action, that is probably the simplest thing here, is just what they're trying to do. The resource, you also saw that it could be a thing, and it could be a thing within a context. So it could be a picture within an album. So you get hierarchies even at the resource. And plus the attributes. What can be an attribute? Time. You could have a date and a time in which you're allowed to do something, and outside of the time you are not. Now you may be seeing the power of ABAC. You can do just so much. You can have so much control and granularity in the things that you can and cannot do. If you would like an example of a real-world application that uses ABAC, AWS. AWS has YAM and YAM policies, and that ugly JSON is an ABAC policy where you have who's trying to do, what they're trying to do, and you may have additional conditions that are going to result in allows and denies. The other type here that we have is ReBAC. And ReBAC is super interesting. It's when a principal with a relationship to a resource can do an action. So it kind of looks simpler than ABAC in a sense. You have less elements, although in practice you find that vendors and tools kind of mix ABAC and ReBAC, and sometimes your vendor that provides you with technology to do ReBAC will also let you do attributes here. So from a conceptual level, maybe this is all you want to start with, but eventually you want to do attributes as well. But on a basic form, you are going to have something in a relationship with something else. That's it. And if you want a real-world example of an application that uses ReBAC, think about Google Drive. Google Drive, you have your user and your group of users, and you have your files, and you have your folders. And when you create a file in a folder, maybe there's a certain group of users who will automatically gain access to that file just because the file is in a folder. So you can see that there is this graph database that is connecting users to resources. And so this allows for a super fast and efficient authorization evaluation, which is really interesting about ReBAC. It's sort of a simple model to think about. The things are straightforward, but you will need some kind of graph database to go through the nodes and evaluate if someone has access to something. So yeah, you want to take your application, your use case, and decide what is the right approach. There's no single answer, but for sure, whatever you decide to do, make sure you're separating the layers of your application appropriately so that if you ever start doing something, you can change. If you start with ReBAC, it's totally fine to migrate to something else, but the more you make it clear in your code base where each thing happens, easiest will be for you to do that migration. So I think that's enough of the presentation. Now I will quickly jump into a couple pages. So if you're super confused about Cedar, you can go into their documentation and you can find examples. And remember, we were talking about that example that I showed you. This right here, this right here is an example where you have the user Alice that can do these actions in this account, right? So super high level, but you can see a couple things. And if you want to think about attributes, you've got lots of examples here, such as taking the principal, doing the action and checking their department, checking a job level attribute. You can do a lot, right? You can check on the resource, and if the resource is a file type JPEG, then you are allowed to view, right? It really is super powerful, and you're going to find that your users will really enjoy this. And the other thing that I want to show you is that there is the service by AWS, Amazon Verified Permissions, which is a fully managed Cedar service. So Cedar is open source, right? It is free to use, but if you want to pay to gain time, maybe this service is nice. I never use it. I just use the open source version and manage the policies myself. But you know, you can check this out and maybe this is the right service for you. The other thing that I want to show you is in GitHub. You have many links that will guide you. And so this is the main core implementation in Rust. So you have a CLI that you can use, but there are also alternative implementations. This one for Golang. You have Cedar here. This one is really nice. And it seems that there's even one for Java. There may be more. So yeah, that's all that I have for today. Make sure you check it out, and the next time that you want to think about a powerful authorization layer for our application, give Cedar a chance. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.